Nostalgia has often been described as comfort food for the soul, making people forget about the present by remembering something good from the past. Like most things that people tend to enjoy though, Hollywood has found a way to weaponize that feeling and market it to the masses. Those animated classics you loved as a kid, well, here they are again, directed like they're a nature documentary. That'll be $1 billion, please. I am, of course, being facetious, and if used correctly and in small doses, nostalgia can, of course, work. For instance, Leonard Nimoy brought some real gravitas to the rebooted Star Trek timeline, but sadly, the vast majority of blockbusters these days feel the need to make overt and distracting references to the history of their franchise. And when the filmmakers lean on the nostalgia too heavily, it can often end up hurting the eventual product. These are movies that tried to exploit nostalgia and failed. Alien Covenant. Prometheus, Ridley Scott's technically but not quite alien movie, turned out to be hugely divisive. Some fans loved the detailed world building and incredible production design, while others criticized it for being a little too grandiose and failing to fully explore or develop many of the lofty philosophical ideas hinted at in the script. Perhaps sensing the backlash to a potential sequel then, the decision was made to abandon the majority of the story threads established in Prometheus in favor of steering things back towards more recognizable territory, with the alien prefix now added to the title and the iconic xenomorphs brought back and placed front and center in the marketing to make things even clearer that this was an alien movie. And Covenant isn't a bad film by any means, but it feels as though there was a studio-mandated checklist of things that needed to be included to make it feel like an alien movie. And instead of bringing anything new to the table, these moments just trigger your nostalgia for the first two installments and remind you that you've seen all of this before.
Ben-Hur 2016. So far, there have been 5 film adaptations of the 1880 novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, but the one that most people are familiar with released in 1959. That film won 11 Academy Awards and stands as an example of epic storytelling and remarkable filmmaking. But the biggest remake came in 2016, and it bombed. There has been an attempt at revitalizing the nostalgia of the sword and sandal genre since the success of 2000's Gladiator, and Ben-Hur was easily the most ambitious of these projects. One of the biggest differences between the 2016 version and the 1959 one came in its runtime, which was almost an hour and a half shorter, making the story seem rushed and truncated. The production budget for Ben-Hur ended up costing around $100 million, though it only managed to pull in $94 million at the global box office. The fans didn't care for the adaptation, and the critics tore it apart, making this an expensive lesson in the cost of nostalgic enterprises.
Dumb and Dumber 2. One of the most beloved studio comedies of the 1990s, Dumb and Dumber launched the careers of the Farrelly brothers and solidified Jim Carrey as Hollywood's biggest funny man. Over the next 2 decades, the key creatives were constantly asked about a follow-up, partly due to the industry's newfound love for nostalgia, and also to erase those horrible memories of the horrendous 2003 prequel that shall not be named here. When Dumb and Dumber 2 finally reached theaters in November 2014, most people were in agreement that catching up with Harry and Lloyd 20 years later was probably a big mistake. Gone are the 2 innocent and lovable idiots from the original, replaced by 2 spiteful and sad middle-aged men spitting out bad jokes and references to the first movie. The cross-country road trip, Billy the blind kid from 4C, Lloyd daydreaming about killing bad guys, a hitman that rides along with the duo, and the second most annoying sound in the world do nothing but highlight how creatively bankrupt Dumb and Dumber 2 really is, with the vast majority of the original comedy falling painfully flat.
Power Rangers. When it was on television, Power Rangers was one of the most popular television series for kids and young adults. Despite running on a near continuous basis, fans had been hoping for a theatrical film for more than 20 years, with the last having been released in 1997. In 2017, they got their wish, and the film made every effort to tap into the nostalgic base of the younger audience from the 90s, who were well into adulthood in 2017 and wanted a darker, grittier Power Rangers. And that's exactly what Lionsgate gave them in the form of a reboot, which focused on the main characters from the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers television series from 1993, but sadly, it didn't do so well. Worldwide, Power Rangers only managed to pull in $142 million, which is a paltry sum where action-adventure superhero movies are concerned. The production budget of $105 million, coupled with the movie's promotional budget, meant a massive financial loss, and talk of a franchise stopped dead in its tracks.
Men in Black International. The Men in Black franchise may have earned over $1.5 billion at the box office, but it seemed like a strange idea to continue the series without original stars Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, whose brilliant double act carried the original trilogy even through its weaker moments. Well, that is, unless we could have gotten that rumoured Men in Black Jump Street crossover, which would have been awesome, but alas, it was not to be. It may have existed in some form for over 20 years now, but is the Men in Black franchise really popular enough to get audiences invested in a new installment that doesn't feature the original stars? Well, apparently not. Without Smith or Jones, International simply welds a story onto the tropes and iconography established in previous movies that people remember. And that's about all it has to offer. Black suits, sunglasses, neuralizers, a mode of transport with a big red button, tiny guns that are incredibly powerful, Frank the Pug, a veteran actor playing the stoic head of an MIB branch, and celebrity aliens are all featured. And yet they only highlight how little genuine inventiveness or originality can be found in Men in Black International. Chris Hemsworth and Tessa Thompson were great in Thor Ragnarok, but it turns out lightning doesn't strike twice. Predators. Following the release of last year's Shane Black-directed The Predator, Nimrod Antal's 2010 entry in the iconic sci-fi series is no longer even considered canon. Coming at a time when nostalgia wasn't quite so prevalent in franchise filmmaking as it is today, Predators is a decent enough shoot-'em-up, albeit one that leans a little too heavily on John McTiernan's classic original. An ensemble cast of trained killers, present and accounted for, but this one-dimensional parade of cannon fodder is nowhere near as interesting as Dutch's memorable team of commandos. A jungle setting? Yep, that's here too, but this time it's an alien jungle. The lead character covering himself in mud and setting traps using the environment to battle the Predator in hand-to-hand combat? Of course that's here, but despite packing on the muscle, Adrian Brody simply cannot hold a candle to Arnold Schwarzenegger. On top of all that, Alan Silvestri's score is repurposed at various points during the movie, Long Tall Sally plays over the closing credits, and the audience is left with a pervasive feeling that they've seen it all before.
The Mummy. One of the biggest film franchises of all time is Universal Pictures' monster movieverse, which was built over several decades in the 1950s and 60s with numerous films including Frankenstein, The Wolfman, Dracula, and many, many more. In 1999, the franchise was revitalized with Brendan Fraser's The Mummy movies, and in 2017, Universal tried another reboot in the form of a planned franchise. The first film attempting to capitalize on the nostalgia was 2017's The Mummy, which starred Tom Cruise as the hero role against the titular movie monster. With Cruise headlining the film, the movie was on track to pull in a ton of cash, and it succeeded, mostly. The film was expensive, and by the end of production, Universal Pictures spent almost $200 million to finish the film. The Mummy made $410 million at the worldwide box office, and while that's a lot of money, the huge production costs associated with the promotional financing meant it lost money for the studio. Not only did the film fail to meet expectations, but its poor showing resulted in the death of the Dark Universe. Universal shelved this plan and is refocusing on standalone projects after abandoning its heavily promoted franchise.
Ghostbusters. Rebooting such a popular movie is a tricky balancing act for any studio, as the filmmakers need to respect the original without relying on it too much, while also creating something that stands on its own merits. This, sadly, is where 2016's Ghostbusters failed, as despite some pretty decent work from the four leads, the improv-heavy style meshed awkwardly with the reverence shown to Ivan Reitman's 1984 classic, with even the opening scenes of each movie ending in near-identical fashion. Cameos from Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, Ernie Hudson, Annie Potts, Sigourney Weaver, Slimer, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, and of course Zool didn't exactly sway the notion that the reboot was coasting on the reputation of the original. It wasn't the childhood-destroying nightmare many fans claimed it would be, but it did end up as a huge box office bomb and is estimated to have lost Columbia Pictures up to $125 million.
Blade Runner 2049. The original Blade Runner from 1982 is often considered to be one of the greatest science fiction films of all time, so talk of a sequel has been around for more than 30 years before it finally became a reality in 2017. Blade Runner 2049 hoped to capitalize on the nostalgia of the first film by going after the fans of Ridley Scott's original masterpiece. While the movie succeeded in delivering on what it promised, it didn't do nearly as well as was predicted, and despite winning 2 Academy Awards for Best Cinematography and Best Visual Effects, the movie was something of a financial disappointment. It cost Warner Bros. Pictures an estimated $185 million to produce, and that figure was nearly doubled because of promotional costs. When the box office tally for worldwide distribution was finally in, the movie only managed to make $250 million. In the case of Blade Runner 2049, the nostalgia had been left to sit for too long, making the movie less of a reminder of the original and more of a disappointing continuation the studio took its time delivering. On its own merits though, the film is still bloody good.
Independence Day Resurgence. Independence Day is one of the defining movies of the 1990s, regardless of any genre. It is simply the best. It is, cinema. It is gorgeous and everyone loves it. The iconic destruction of the White House both popularized the teaser trailer and the practice of ending marketing materials on a money shot. It also marked a comeback for both massive scale disaster movies and sci-fi epics. It launched Will Smith to the top of the Hollywood A-list and became the second highest grossing movie in history at the time, after earning $817 million. One thing it didn't do though was set itself up nicely for a sequel, and it took a full 20 years before we got Independence Day Resurgence, a hugely inferior follow-up that failed to earn even half as much at the box office as its predecessor. Will Smith wouldn't return, so they made his son one of the main characters this time around. Brent Spiner was great as the crazy scientist in the original, so they put him in a coma for 20 years and had him play the exact same role, the exact same way. Bill Pullman's cheesy as all hell presidential speech was great the first time around, so he gets another one here. Everyone has daddy issues, and yep, of course, Jeff Goldblum is just there. The thing is, fans did want to catch up with these characters, but it felt like they were only included to tick nostalgia boxes.
Justice League. It seems as if all of Hollywood is on a nostalgic kick where superhero reboots and launches are concerned, and while Warner Bros. And DC have been making superhero films for decades, 2017's Justice League was meant to solidify the DCEU as a viable franchise comparable to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. To set up the film, the studio released Man of Steel, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, Suicide Squad, and Wonder Woman, with each of those films doing relatively well, though some were considerably more panned than others. After Wonder Woman's success at the box office, it appeared as if Justice League would offer a continued improvement, but it never managed to meet expectations. The film received generally mixed reviews from critics, and on Rotten Tomatoes it sits at around 40% approval, which is not good. When it hit theaters and didn't wow audiences as planned, the entire focus of the DCEU was retooled, and a slew of planned projects were altered or outright cancelled. It was one of the most expensive movies ever made, with a budget of $300 million coupled with a production budget that came close to that amount. When the dust settled, it made just shy of $658 million, which is a lot of money, but too little to make a decent profit for the studio.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Out of the Shadows. The 2014 reboot of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was not a very good movie, but it was a successful one, earning almost $500 million worldwide. The sequel, tragically, was even worse, made half as much money, and ended up killing at least this iteration of the franchise. The first installment introduced the terrifying-looking hulking CGI incarnations of Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, and Michelangelo, and also established other core characters like Splinter, April O'Neil, Vern Fenwick, and Shredder. But possibly in the wake of the negative reception to the reboot, the sequel doubles down and brings in virtually every other recognizable character that was available to it. Bebop, Rocksteady, Casey Jones, Krang, and the Technodrome all appear, turning Out of Shadows into an overstuffed mess, but it's almost impressive to see how dull the movie is despite all of this fan service. You almost get the sneaking suspicion that the filmmakers were pleading to fans, "We know you didn't really like the last movie, but look at all this stuff you remember from your childhood," and it sadly wasn't enough.
A Wrinkle in Time. There have been several attempts at adapting the classic 1962 novel A Wrinkle in Time over the years, and because the book was so widely read in primary school by millions of young readers, Walt Disney Pictures keeps trying to make it work. The studio succeeded with a made-for-TV version in 2003, and it attempted to recreate that success with a feature film in 2018. The movie came with a lot of promises, featuring a star-studded cast, brilliant special effects, and a timeless return to a world that reminded people of their early years of reading. Sadly, the movie ended up bombing so badly for the studio, the financial losses were staggering. A Wrinkle in Time cost Disney an estimated $103 million to produce, and the cost ended up totaling around $150 million by the time it finally hit theaters. All told, the movie ended up costing Disney around $131 million in losses, and while the studio isn't hurting too badly, thanks to Avengers Infinity War, which was released the same year, it would be hard to call A Wrinkle in Time anything but a massive financial failure.
Terminator Genesis. Refusing to let the T-800 ride off into the sunset after the first two classic entries, the Terminator franchise has instead spent the best part of 3 decades now convoluting the timeline. Rise of the Machines delivered a straight-up sequel, Salvation gave fans the future set war movie they thought they wanted, until McG titted it up anyway, and then Genesis decided to dive back into the past and revisit the original's 1984 setting, with less than stellar results. We see the war-ravaged future again. Kyle Reese goes back in time to save Sarah Connor again. Arnold Schwarzenegger picks a nice night for a walk again. A T-1000 appears again. Someone says, "Come with me if you want to live" again. And the list just goes on. There are some tweaks made to the established mythology, namely the John Connor twist. That was obviously spoiled in the trailers, but the entire plot is basically comprised of things that have been done before and done much, much better.
Dark Phoenix. It could be said that all of the films released in the first-class X-Men series were attempts at nostalgia where fans of Marvel Comics are concerned, and the final one, Dark Phoenix, is probably the most important of them all. In terms of the comics, the Dark Phoenix saga was a huge event for Marvel Comics. The story was written by Chris Claremont with illustrations by John Byrne, and it ran through most of 1980. It tore apart the X-Men and had a lasting impact on Jean Grey and the team as a whole. Attempting to capitalize on that story was certainly a product of nostalgia, but given how much the fans loved the story, any adaptation was bound to be heavily scrutinized. When it finally made it to film, the number of changes and tweaks done to Claremont's story made Dark Phoenix almost unrecognizable when compared to the books. The movie was a considerable failure at the box office, and while it could be said that the critics weren't kind, the fans were far beyond disappointed. The movie lost millions, and it concluded the franchise in an underwhelming manner. That being said, the cast was praised for the performances they gave, and the score was well received, but overall it was a major letdown.
Pixels. Genuinely, Pixels could have been a great movie had it not wasted such an interesting concept on a standard Adam Sandler vehicle. The story's unique hook could have capitalized on the rising trend of 1980s nostalgia infiltrating modern pop culture at the time, especially with Chris Columbus directing. After all, he did have a hand in Gremlins, The Goonies, Adventures in Babysitting, and Home Alone. What we got instead was Kevin James as the President of the United States, and a non-stop barrage of references that substituted decent humor for a scattershot, hey, you remember this approach that only solidified the video game movie curse. Pac-Man, Gallagher, Frogger, Duck Hunt, Donkey Kong, Tetris, Max Headroom, the list goes on and on. But the movie doesn't really do anything with all this iconography besides the one note the military can't save the world, but these nerds can running gag. Based on the premise and potential, Pixels could have been Ghostbusters with video games. Instead, it's implied that Peter Dinklage, with a mullet, has sex with Serena Williams and Martha Stewart in the White House. Cinema's over.
Terminator Dark Fate. The Terminator franchise has had its highs and lows, but it seems like the lows keep getting lower as time goes on and with every attempt made at revitalizing the franchise. Despite past failures, things were looking good when James Cameron returned for Terminator Dark Fate. After all, Cameron was the man behind the machine, and the first 2 films are epic classics. Not only was Cameron returning for the story, but Linda Hamilton was also making a comeback after skipping out on the movies that came between Terminator 2 and Dark Fate. Fans were optimistic that the franchise would get a new start, and talk of a trilogy was already underway when the movie hit theaters. While the film attempted to recreate some of the classic nuances that should have appealed to the fans of the first 2 films, it failed in a big way when it came to an underwhelming performance at the box office. By the time receipts were counted, the movie, which had an estimated break-even point between 450 and 480 million, was on track to lose a whopping 130 mil. Talk of a new franchise immediately ceased, plans for any sequels were scrapped, and the only talk about the Terminator franchise following this movie's release was a general agreement that the franchise was effectively dead.
Solo, a Star Wars story. You don't need me to tell you that Han Solo is one of the most iconic figures in the history of pop culture. And as played by Harrison Ford, the charismatic smuggler instantly came across as a fully formed three-dimensional character from the second he appeared on screen in A New Hope all the way back in 1977. In Solo, Alden Ehrenreich does the best he can, stepping into shoes that simply cannot be filled, and Donald Glover steals the show as Lando Calrissian. But Solo, a Star Wars story as a whole, feels completely unnecessary. And I'll confess that I genuinely do like the movie much more than other people, but it still baffles me why it goes out of its way to answer questions that just didn't need answering. The scene where Han gets given his surname is awful. Darth Maul cameos because Disney knew the character had become a cult favourite, the Kessel Run was much better off left to the imagination, and even Han's blaster and golden dice get a backstory. The old saying in the movie business is show don't tell, but Solo decides to completely ignore that advice and force-feed the audience the minutiae of Han's backstory in what can only be described as fan service at its worst.
Charlie's Angels. Charlie's Angels was a massive hit on television back in the late 70s and early 80s, and following a successful trilogy release between 2000 and 2003, a new movie was launched in 2019. The film had a lot going for it, with Elizabeth Banks on hand to direct a stellar cast, and the new film was designed as a continuation of the original film trilogy, and it even had Drew Barrymore on as an executive producer, so it was feasible that fans of those movies would be interested in seeing a follow-up story featuring new angels. When the movie made it to theaters in November 2019, it immediately flopped. With a budget of around 55 million, the movie only managed to make 51 million at the worldwide box office. Not only did the movie lose a ton of money, but the director came out with some controversial criticism of her own the week prior to its release. The kickback on her Twitter tirade resulted in more negative press directed towards the film, which resulted in a massive financial loss for Sony.